All right, I've been hearing a lot about this, and I felt like I wanted to give my input on the matter. It's been coming up way too much, both in conversation with neighbors and coworkers, and also scrolling across my YouTube feed. A lot of people are talking right now about Roe versus Wade being overturned in Alabama. I believe that was back in 2022. And then this other incident that happened this year, February 16th, 2024, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that frozen embryos are considered children under state law. So that means that frozen embryos, a very small collection of cells that are no bigger than the size of a pea or a walnut, have been granted personhood and essentially have the same human rights as any given child or adult human being. This is making a lot of women very worried about having control of their bodies taken from them by the government, and I don't blame them for worrying, because we've been here before, haven't we? So again, an embryo, a very small cluster of cells that's no bigger than maybe a grape, has the same rights as the mother carrying it. That's ridiculous to me. One of the reasons why that is ridiculous to me, and I pulled up some statistics, is because, for one thing, so the estimates vary slightly depending on the source, but for example, this one article claims that, where is it? I might have scrolled past it already. Anyway, so roughly 12%, there it is, roughly 12% of all pregnancies are twins. They start off as twins at least, but only about 1.3% are live births of twins. So that means around 10% of all pregnancies. That suggests, based on the statistics offered by this specific source, and again, the stats vary slightly based on the source, but you could probably comfortably, reasonably say that roughly around 10% of all pregnancies in the entire human species are twins. They started off as twins, and one twin absorbed the other twin. You know, they started off as twins, but only one baby came out at the end of the 9 months, and that's because the surviving baby absorbed its twin in utero, right? And I think that this source says that, yeah, about 20 to 30% of multiple pregnancies may experience vanishing twin syndrome. That's what it's called. So it's suggesting, if I'm reading it correctly, that 20 to 30% of multiple pregnancies, meaning pregnancies involving twins or more, triplets, what have you, roughly 20 to 30% of those pregnancies result in vanishing twin syndrome. And that's when one of the twins absorbs the other twin. So now, if legally an embryo has the same human rights as any adult, well then you could say that about 10%, roughly 10% possibly a little more. 10% of the entire human population is guilty of committing homicide, technically. And not just any homicide, but murdering their own sibling. Does that sound ridiculous to you? It sounds ridiculous to me, but technically, you could make that argument if embryos have human rights. So, that's one of the reasons why. Okay? If an embryo can be absorbed, I'm sorry, I don't think that I'm 40 years old. It's been 40 years since I came out of my mother's body. I've never heard tell of a person, once they were birthed out of their mother, being absorbed by another person. Unless an illegal act of cannibalism took place. That would be, and we do consider that to be very illegal. If one adult human being ends the life of another human being and consumes their flesh, that's known as cannibalism, and it's very illegal in most places in the world, right? But that's about the only way that a human being who has already been birthed out of their mother's body, that's about the only way that one human being can be absorbed by another human being. Right? So if an embryo can be absorbed by another embryo, or a fetus can be absorbed by another fetus, I'd say that right there disqualifies them from being a fully fledged human being. They have not developed into a fully fledged human being yet. And so therefore they should not be granted the rights of a fully fledged human being. So chew on that for a little while. Then there's also this. If you consider the fact that sometimes the surviving twin, at some stage in their life, will present with a growth or a tumor of some sort, and it's the result of an absorbed twin. So it's inside the tumor or the growth will often be tiny little teeth and hair and some bone fragments, maybe spinal column, and that is their absorbed twin that was not totally absorbed. So some actual bodily parts of the twin remained in a little fleshy sac that's attached to the surviving twin. Now, as far as I know, as far as I've heard, when these tumors are found, they're typically removed. But again, if an embryo, just a collection of a few cells that is no bigger than a small piece of fruit, if that qualifies as a human being and has human rights, again, somebody could make the argument that removing a tumor from a surviving twin that contains the body parts of an absorbed twin, that could be possibly considered an act of aggression. It could be considered assault, or again, even a form of homicide against the absorbed twin, because it's possible that if there's any kind of blood flow going through that tumor, or to those little tiny body parts in the tumor, you could make the argument that at least a part of the absorbed twin is still alive, if you can call that life, and that to remove that from the fully developed surviving twin would be to end that life, whatever it is, the life of the absorbed twin. So these are some very problematic situations that we face if we start giving embryos the fully the human rights that belong to fully developed, fully fledged adult human beings, and developing children that have been birthed from their mothers. So we really need to consider some of this. I think that, so where is it? Yeah, here it is. So I think with this specific case, it was some frozen embryos were destroyed that belonged to a few different couples, and they sued the clinic for a wrongful death of a minor. I think that at best it should have been something along the lines of destruction of private property. Those embryos were certainly the property of the parents, but they were not fully developed human beings. I consider a fully developed human being to be someone or something that can survive outside of its mother's body. So that said, I will say that I do think that abortion should not be allowed. Terminating a pregnancy should not be allowed in later stages of pregnancy, unless it poses a real threat to the mother's health. So let's say she's 7 or 8 months along, and for whatever reason, the pregnancy is having a very serious adverse effect on her health and has a high risk of leading to her death. Well, then the pregnancy needs to be terminated, but the way in which it should be terminated is an early C-section, because at that stage, babies can live outside of the mother's body if they've made it to the 7th month or the 8th month, certainly to the 8th month. In which case, the way the pregnancy should be terminated is you have a C-section. The doctors go in and take the baby out properly in such a way that would optimize their survival outside of the mother's body. And I think in most cases, in most pregnancies, if a mother's made it that far in the pregnancy, 7, 8 months, maybe in 6 months, at that point, she's well aware that she's pregnant, typically, and has been looking forward to having the baby, and certainly does not want to have the baby removed from her body before it's reached full term. And yeah, she would likely want to go for that option as well. Is there a way to remove this baby without ending its life? I'd say that my views overall roughly align themselves with something that Louis C.K. says in one of his stand-up specials. So Louis C.K., for those of you who don't know, he's a comedian. And he made a stand-up special several years back where he pretty much states that that abortion is killing a baby. That they are babies, that abortion is killing a baby, but that he thinks that women should have the right to kill babies if they feel that they need to. And again, I'm, for the most part, not totally, there are exceptions in certain circumstances, but for the most part, I'm inclined to agree with that. I think that most women, when they are considering the option of abortion, it's for good reasons. Because the pregnancy was the result of rape or incest, or because the pregnancy runs the risk of killing her. I actually knew a woman like that once. She already had 2 children, 2 healthy children, and they were young though. They still very much needed their mother. And she became pregnant with a 3rd baby by her husband. But at that point, she had developed some kind of a sickness, an illness. I don't remember what it was called, but I think it was something to do with, it was like a blood illness, something like that. And it meant that if she went through with a third pregnancy, there was a really high risk that she would not survive it. There was something like maybe an 80 to 90% chance that she wouldn't survive the pregnancy and or the labor, or even the C-section. So yeah, she was faced with a really tough decision. But my opinion on that matter was, it's better that you terminate that pregnancy than orphan your other two children and leave them without a mother. And I think any man that would disagree with that, and I've met a few who would, overall, what I've noticed about those kinds of dudes is that they tend to view women as being like petri dishes or incubators, like trading cards, collectibles that they can switch out for another one, if something happens to this one. It's like, so what if she dies bringing my baby into this world? I can replace her with another wife. It's like, she's, she might be replaceable in your eyes. She is not replaceable in the eyes of her children, her other children. And even if she doesn't have any other children, like, honestly, I just think guys like that, yeah, they're creeps. They're creeps, and they probably don't deserve the wife or the child to begin with. So, ladies, if you find yourself with a guy like that who wants you to risk your life to bring your child into the world, bring his, quote unquote, his child into the world, you should probably, assuming you're early enough in the pregnancy, I would terminate the pregnancy and leave him immediately. Yeah. I know it's not the easiest decision to make, and this is coming from somebody who's very much all about, the parent should sacrifice for the child. The parent should sacrifice for the child. There are exceptions to everything. And just like there are exceptions to the fact that, most women would, if they are choosing to get an abortion, it's for a good reason, or it's something that they think is a good reason. It's a hard decision for them to make. It's not something they're doing lightly. That said, I have heard testimony from people who were members of, are still currently members of devil worshipping cults, where they talked about women, females. I don't like gifting them the title of woman. They barely qualify if they're doing something like this. But I have heard stories of some females in devil worshipping cults doing things like getting themselves pregnant on purpose so that they can have an abortion in order to please the devil, and that they will actually do this or attempt to do it many times, several times. I definitely disagree with that. That is not a good reason to either get pregnant or to terminate a pregnancy. Not at all. Not only is it really unfair to do, I mean, why would you create the life? Why would you conceive the life just to turn around and kill it, a few weeks or a few months later? That's just sick. But it's also, I think it's unwise to do to yourself and your own body. It certainly can't have good effects on your body. And I think it just furthers my argument that if the devil were an actual manifested physical entity, he hates women and he hates mothers. And he absolutely wants to trick women, females, into damaging themselves and harming themselves emotionally, psychologically, and physically. But even if that were the case, even if there really is something like the devil or hell and stuff, and even if he wants you to get abortions, that does not mean that abortion should be illegal. That does not mean that women should not be allowed to get abortions if they think that it is absolutely necessary for one reason or another. And I'll tell you another reason why I know some women choose to terminate their pregnancies is because they feel like they cannot provide the proper situation for that child for whatever reason, for various reasons. Perhaps they're single, they're not married to the father, perhaps they are barely making ends meet themselves, they can barely pay their own bills, let alone pay the bills for a child. Perhaps the father has already said that he won't have anything to do with the kid, that he won't pay, or he'll do everything he can to avoid paying. I know that I've known mothers who, the government granted them child support from the father of their children, and it was a ridiculous amount of money, ridiculously low. One mother I spoke to, and I can't, I never saw any evidence to support this, but what she told me was that the government only forced the father of her son to give her $50 a month for him. And when I heard that, my jaw almost dropped down and touched the floor. I was like, what? That's insane. That's shameful. Children certainly cost more than $50 a month. How is the government only forcing him to pay you $50 a month? So for those of you out there saying, like, the government will make him pay for his kid, maybe not. And even if they order him in court to pay more than that, even if they order him to pay enough to cover the costs of the child, that doesn't mean that he will be able to pay it or that he will pay it. Some men would sooner go to prison. Some men are that lazy and spiteful. So, and I've met at least one or two of those as well. And yeah, and I've seen, unfortunately, way too many cases of mothers who, for whatever reason, had a baby in circumstances where they really shouldn't have had a baby. They did not have the resources. They didn't own a home. They didn't have a house. They lived in like a ghetto. They maybe didn't even have a car, or at least not a well-functioning car. They didn't have a good job, if any job at all. Living off food stamps. They weren't able to give their kids the proper nutrition, proper education, or really a lot of their time. Because if they're working 9 to 5, 6, maybe 7 days a week, because they got to pay the bills, because the guy is not helping out, or even both of them are just, don't have great jobs. They're not pulling down a lot of money. They can't afford to take enough time off work to really spend quality time with the kid. The kid really needs their mom around. That's going to result in the kid being handed off to possibly to at best other family members, at worst neighbors, shady daycares. They end up in after school programs, and you can't account for what's going on in the minds of the people working there. So again, I would encourage all of you, please do your due diligence and do some research into the kinds of tactics that pedophiles and child predators engage in, like seeking employment at places like that, daycares, starting daycares, after school programs, so on and so forth, so that they can gain access to vulnerable children who don't have a lot of parental guidance because their parents are just constantly working. And when they're not working, they're so exhausted, they just have no time for the kid. And again, they can't do things like cook proper meals for the kid. The kid ends up, they grow up living off of SpaghettiOs. And so that's going to affect their nutrition. That's going to affect their physical development. This is all going to affect their psychological and emotional development. And really, you're just setting up this kid for a life of drudgery and turmoil and suffering. And they really aren't going to go very far in life. And you can hardly lay all that at their feet. They very much were born into it, all because, for whatever reason, the mother didn't terminate the pregnancy, even though she really was not in the proper circumstances to be bringing a child into the world. And I do think, and sometimes that happens because we have laws against abortion in some places, and also because sometimes we have women raised in families that are really strict, fundamentalist, religious families that frown upon abortion and preach that you're going to burn in hell. It's evil. It's a sin. I think it's a sin to birth a child into a life of torture, where it's just going to be struggle after struggle after struggle, and very little contentment and happiness. They never had a chance from day one. I think that's a sin, to bring a child into that life. So I think that's the bigger sin. What's the bigger sin? Just like, a quick death before the kid, before it's even a kid, when it's an embryo and doesn't even know of its own existence yet, right? Ending it there, or forcing a human being to live a lifetime of torture and struggle, and birthing them into a situation where they just have little to no hope of getting out of, or overcoming. So I think that's the bigger sin, bringing a child into a situation where you can't give them what they need to flourish. And that's how we get these little girls, these teenage girls, in hardcore denial over the fact that they're pregnant. They claim that they didn't know they were pregnant all the way through, up until they're giving birth on the bathroom floor at their high school prom. And I think that's just ridiculous. I think I knew I was pregnant with my daughter by the end of the first month. Most women develop morning sickness by the end of the first month. For sure, by the end of the second or third month, they know. If they're being realistic with themselves. The few cases, again, where I hear about, the girl claiming, I didn't know I was pregnant until I was giving birth at 9 months. Like, you knew, you just didn't want to accept it. You were in extreme denial, probably because you were not in a situation where you felt like you could safely get an abortion, because it was either illegal or you were raised by people who told you that you were going to burn in hell for all eternity if you did something like that. And then that's how we get situations like that one girl, I forget her name, that teenage girl who gave birth to her baby daughter, one night and buried her alive in the backyard because she just didn't know what to do. She was so scared. And there are a lot of YouTube videos out there. I wish I could remember the name right now. This happened only a few years ago. But you can actually study the text messages between this teenage girl and her mother, and it's pretty easy to see just by reading through the text messages from this teenage girl's mother. She was set up for this. her mother was shallow and narcissistic and taught this girl to value herself based on what everyone else thought of her. And yeah, it was really hard to lay too much of the blame at that teenage girl's feet once you get a grasp of the quote unquote woman who raised her. You know, she was taught very much like, you know, that she should worry about what her boyfriend thinks of, you know, her weight and all that. It's like, wow, lady, what are you doing to your daughter? And this is why your granddaughter was buried alive in the backyard. Anyway. So yeah, and I do think that if the kid can survive outside of the mother's body, then they've missed the boat. If the mother's missed the boat on her ability to make the decision about whether or not she can terminate the pregnancy with an abortion. If it's necessary, medically necessary, in the later stages of the pregnancy to remove the baby, it's the baby at that point, in my opinion. Then there are ways of going about that to minimize the risk of the baby's death. And with all our modern medical advancements, we should be able to extract those babies from their mothers without killing them if they're that far along in the pregnancy. But up until that stage, for at least the first few months, for at least the first 3 months, I would say that it is the mother's business. It's her body, it's her business. And so long as she's making the decision for the right reasons, for moral, ethical reasons, and not totally selfish reasons like I'm trying to get favors from the devil. But again, typically most women, when they're considering this option, they're doing it for serious reasons. They're not taking this decision lightly. I've met and spoken to a good number of women who either made this choice or had to at least consider it for various reasons. And I'm trying to remember if there's anything else I wanted to say. Yeah, it's scary that we might be slipping backwards legally into the dark ages here when it comes to women having control over their own bodies. I wouldn't go so far as to say what Louis C.K. says, you know, women should just be allowed to kill babies. Babies, no. Fetuses and embryos, yes. Growing within their own bodies, yes. Within the first, at least the first 3 months of pregnancy, yes. And again, most women, I think even really all women, are well aware by the time they're 3 months along of the fact that they're pregnant. There are just too many signs and symptoms pointing to that. A lot of women out there might be in extreme denial about it and trying to wish it away, but I think the more that we remove the stigma of abortion and replace it with a notion of better that you terminate that pregnancy than bring that child into a situation where you can't offer it what it needs to develop properly. You know, better you end the suffering of that child before it even begins. By ending the embryo before it becomes a child, than to birth a kid into a life of struggle that it can't escape from. I think the more that we push that narrative rather than the, you know, abortion is murder and you're going to burn in hell narrative, I think the better off everyone will be overall in the long run. It's a shady gray area, but I think I've done my best right now, at least, to cut through it a bit and set up some clear boundaries. And also, I will say this, that when it comes to pushing that narrative of women shouldn't be allowed to control their bodies, women shouldn't be allowed to get abortions, it's murder, you'll burn in hell, blah blah blah, I do think that ultimately the people behind that narrative are the ones at the elites that are at the very tippy top of the pyramid, the power pyramid. They might not be publicly, openly pushing it, but I think at the very least behind closed doors, they are supporting that and making that idea spread throughout at the very least, they're keeping it a stigma, and causing it to spread throughout the population. Why? Well, because if they want to maintain their position at the top of the pyramid, they need most of the population to stay down at the bottom of the pyramid. And one of the best ways to do that is to make sure that most of the population is born into less than ideal circumstances, where they will receive a poor education, poor nutrition, little to no attention or focus from their parents. Their parents are running around like chickens with their heads cut off, just trying to make ends meet, working constantly to pay the bills. And or we're in this culture of no marriage, single moms. Dudes think that they're a little prince, and they don't know why they should have to support a family if they get a woman pregnant. This all adds up to kids not having a good childhood, not developing properly physically, emotionally, psychologically, and that will essentially set them up for a life of quote unquote slavery. Really, it's just basically it's modern day slavery. This is what modern day slavery looks like. Most of the population is set up from day one, from before they're even born, to live a life of struggle and barely ever being able to get ahead. At least not without selling their souls and their integrity to the elites, by doing some very unsavory, unethical things. And this is how the elites maintain a population of slaves. For sure, they make sure that their kids are well educated. That I'll bet you anything, most of them understand, most if not all of them understand, their kids need their mother, or at the very least, their kids need a primary caregiver who is just attentive and focused on them all the time, even if it's a nanny, an au pair. But, the richy riches of the world, the millionaires and billionaires, they can afford to let their baby mamas be stay-at-home, their wives be stay-at-home moms. They can afford the best education for their kids. They can afford the best food and nutrition for their kids, so on and so forth. The best kind of housing for their kids, safe neighborhoods, so on and so forth. So, and that's because they want to maintain their position at the top of the pyramid, and they want to be able to pass the reins over to their children, and they want your children to be slaves to their children. So the elites, the millionaires, I'm not counting people out there who have like a couple $1 million. I'm talking about the people who have millions and millions of dollars, mega millionaires, billionaires, those people for sure, the 1% of the 1%, and possibly, what do I know, maybe even some people out there with a couple million. Those people They don't want to have to scrub their own toilets. They don't want to have to do their own laundry. They don't want to have to do the menial labor and such. And how can they get other people to do the menial labor for them for very little money unless those people have no other options? And so they're going to go out of their way to set up society so that, again, most of the population is born into shitty circumstances. So something for you to consider. I think, that, again, that's why I think better that you abort the baby, abort the fetus before it becomes a baby, than birth a slave to these assholes. Right? Start looking into, I mean, like, all the videos coming out now about, what a fraud Elon Musk is. The fact that Bill Gates was, rubbing elbows with Jeffrey Epstein. These kinds of people don't deserve to have your children or you as their slaves. Do they? They really don't. They're jerk-offs, they're clowns, they're frauds. So, yeah. All right, I'm going to leave that there. And good night.